Hey guys, Goffy here with another video, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at these two. This is the Leica M240 and the Fuji X100v. I've done a similar video comparing these two cameras but with colour JPEGs, and in today's video we're going to be having a look at black and white JPEGs. This is not going to be a super technical review, this is more about the look and feel of the images between these two cameras and how they render black and white. Pretty much all of the images have been shot at f8. The Fuji X100v has a 23mm lens on it, it's crop sensor, so it's a 35mm equivalent, and the Leica M240 I was using the Voigtlander 28mm, so two slightly different focal lengths. I know two different focal lengths, it can make the comparison a little bit tougher, but this was a weekend away for me and I wanted to use two different focal lengths to capture the trip. Now I know the Leica is super expensive and the Fuji has a million different JPEG settings that we could play with, but this isn't a review comparing the prices and the features of these two cameras. This is just using the straight out of camera black and white JPEGs. So in the Fuji I was using the Acros, in the Leica I was just using the black and white emulation mode, and arguably that's how Leica and Fuji want you to experience the black and white images straight out of the box. So if anything, this is the Leica and the Fuji feel. The trip itself was a couple days down in Canterbury, which is over on the sort of southeast side of the UK, down near sort of Dover, Folkestone. It's in the Kent area. To begin with, we headed off and took a look around the city and the cathedral that it has in its centre. My initial thoughts looking at these images is they are very similar. I was expecting a little bit more of a defined look. I'm not in a good or a bad way, just expecting a bit more of a difference between the two files. Taking a look at these initial images from inside the cathedral, it looks like in sort of complex lighting scenarios that the Fuji is actually a little bit better at handling this. The stained glass windows, the light coming in and it being quite dark in the cathedral, it's quite a hard one for a camera to work out what you want to expose. I feel like with the Leica it tried to balance the image a little bit too much. It took a bit of the detail out of the stained glass window because it exposed a little bit too bright. Whereas the Fuji got exposure pretty much bang on, and you can see all the detail in the stained glass window, and the area around the windows in a little bit of shadows. So by the looks of it, to kick off, it looks like the Fuji is a little bit better when it comes to exposure. It was quite dark in the cathedral and most of these shots were shot at f8 on both of these cameras, and shooting at f8 whilst inside meant the ISO had to be bumped up quite a lot, and some of the images inside were shot at 1600 and 3200 ISO. Now for modern cameras this isn't really that big of a deal, but for the Leica that's pretty old now, its performance when it starts to get to this sort of level starts to sort of deteriorate a little bit. You can see when you zoom into some of the images that there is quite a lot more noise reduction being applied to the Leica JPEGs as opposed to the Fuji ones, which is a little bit annoying when it comes to a black and white image, because if you just flick a noisy image to black and white, it quite often, the noise comes off looking a little bit like grain, so you can often get away with it, but it looks like Leica are applying quite a lot of noise reduction to their JPEGs to get rid of some of this sort of noisy, grainy effect. Now here's a really subjective one, and it might just be me going a little bit mad, but looking at these two images taken down an alleyway, is it me or does the Leica image look warmer? I know these are black and white images, but is it just me or can you see it too? If you do, let me know down in the comments, or if you know a little bit more as to why a black and white image can feel warm, I'd be really interested to know. It's very subjective and I don't think it really matters either way, it's just going to be down to personal preference. I think I like the slightly warmer sort of feel to an image rather than the slightly colder look, and that actually links very well into the previous video I shot where we looked at the colour JPEG settings of these two cameras, and the Leica images were generally warmer and the Fuji images were generally cooler. It's not really a pro or con either way, and it's easily adjusted in post, but straight out of camera I think I slightly prefer the sort of warmish look of the Leica. Having wandered around Canterbury for the morning, we then took a trip over to Whitstable, which is just up from Canterbury on the coast. I know Whitstable for a really nice ale that they do, but it turns out they're really famous for oysters. And talking about those oysters, looking at this sign, you really don't want to head out and try and take any of them. But also looking at this image, I think it shows one of the biggest difference between these two cameras when it comes to black and white, and that's the highlights. The Fuji is really good at controlling those highlights, but I'm not sure that necessarily leads to a nicer looking image. With the Leica image, that little sort of brighter highlights leads to an overall brighter image, and I much prefer how that looks. This is a trend you see across pretty much all of the images that I've shown. The highlights are less controlled and a bit brighter in the Leica, which is technically worse photo, but I much prefer how these images come out. Quite hard to talk about black and white images without talking about contrast, as it's one of the biggest things that you can control. I personally have a preference to liking really contrasty black and white images. That's why I develop and shoot my film the way I do, to kind of increase contrast. So I'm going to be a little bit biased here, but the Leica files are generally more contrasty, and that's something that I like. Might not be something that you like though. You might prefer the kind of slightly flatter looking look that the Fuji offers, but I do quite like the little extra punch of contrast that the Leica offers. So overall then, what are my thoughts on which of these two cameras produces the best black and white images? I think personally I prefer the images from the Leica. Now, they're not technically the best. The Fuji is the better camera in terms of getting better exposure and getting better range in the images. But from a straight out of camera JPEG point of view, I feel like the Leica just has a bit more character to it. It's a bit more contrasty, which is something I like. It's got sort of brighter highlights, which leads to an overall brighter feeling image, another thing that I like too. You might have a preference towards the Fuji files. This is all personal opinion. These two cameras are very closely matched, and I thought the JPEGs were going to have a bigger difference between the two. Like I said at the start, not in a good or a bad way. I just thought they'd have slightly more defined looks to them, when in reality these two cameras produce very similar looking results when it comes to black and white. Where the Fuji does do an awful lot better though is in any sort of difficult scenarios. If things start to get a bit dark, the low light capabilities of this guy is a bit better, even though it's crop sensor, and the sort of difficult lighting scenarios, generally this little guy does a little bit better there too. But for a look and feel, straight out of camera JPEGs, I do prefer the files from the Leica. This has been though a very tight comparison, and I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments. So if you've got a difference of opinion or you agree with me, let me know. I'd be really interested to know what you think. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. There's plenty more Fuji, Leica and film photography content coming, and I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!